Before the cataphract, before the earliest night, and don't even get me started on tanks, there was another mounted force of destruction, the first of its kind. The war chariot, serving both as a display of power and an effective war machine on the battlefields of the Bronze Age. As with all inventions of mankind, we gotta ask some questions. Where did they come from? Why were they so effective? How did different cultures use them? And if they were so good in battle, why did they fall out of use? It's gonna be one hell of a ride, but we're gonna figure all of that out in this episode dedicated to Bronze Age warfare. But before we get to the war part, how did we even come up with the chariot part? Now, let's put the crew aside. We're gonna take a quick look at what you actually need to have a working chariot. Well, the wheel, the cart, and draft animals, ideally domesticated horses. You can say without a doubt that the wheel is one of the most important human inventions, and the earliest currently known example comes from Slovenia, found close in the capital of Ljubljana. It's dated between 5350 to 5100 BC. Now, did it spread, or was it invented simultaneously in separate parts of the world? That's something we're still debating. But by the 4th millennium BC, we find evidence of the wheel from Central Europe all the way to India. And the wheel means vehicles, right? Correct. In the regional context for our story, though, the earliest evidence we have ranges at about 3500 BC in the city of Uruk. As with all great human inventions that were made for day-to-day life, it ends up being used for war. Who would have thought? The Mesopotamian standard of Ur is the earliest depiction we have of battle wagons, dated to 2600 BC. We see crewmen armed with javelins, axes, and as seen on the vulture stele of Lagash, sickle swords. Yes, the great-granddaddy of the Kopesh. This early war machine was extremely heavy and way less maneuverable than its descendants. It didn't have spoked wheels, and it couldn't even pivot, based on some theories. It needed 4 donkeys, onagers, or hybrids to even pull it, but the war wagon was a stable fighting platform that offered protection and mobility. In 1979, there was an experiment with a reconstructed battle wagon. At a speed of 17 kilometers, experts could throw 30 javelins per minute with a distance of up to 60 meters. Two-wheeled versions also appeared, but they were mainly battlefield messengers and transports until they got weaponized. At the end of the 3rd and beginning of the 2nd millennium BC, we have the evolution from battle wagon to chariot proper. As with all things in history of that time period, we have conflicting theories on the chariot's origin. Some will say that the Sintashta culture is the earliest known evidence of chariots, while others will argue that it was an independent, simultaneous development in Mesopotamia. Either way, the chariot quickly became a symbol of how huge your was, and it spread across the known world. Into Europe, as west as the British Isles, and eventually all the way east into China. Technological advancements such as steam-bent wood led to spoked wheels with curved outer rims, more efficient harness types, and a more maneuverable, lighter chariot body. Combining this with domesticated horses, this made chariots a lot faster and a lot deadlier than the battle wagons. We have conflicting information on the domestication process of the horse. The earliest Mesopotamian texts that mention horses refer to them as anshekura, which roughly translates to mountain donkey, and yeah, you can imagine that is very creative. By the early 2nd millennium BC, horses were spread across all of Anatolia and the Fertile Crescent as chariot animals, and we have evidence in the form of seals or of writings such as the one from Shamshi-Adad of Assyria. Now you might be asking, why was there no cavalry around this time period? And the answer to that is simple. Horses were scrawnier at the time, and they were just not capable of carrying armored warriors. You could try, but the horse would just draw pretty quickly. The riders of the time were scouts and messengers, while mounted fighting was reserved for chariots. Much later, with proper breeding, training, and diet changes, we would see real cavalry emerge, but for now, when it comes to horse training, none rivaled the Mitanni. With their heartland in Upper Mesopotamia and northern Syria, the Mitanni were predominantly a Hurrian-speaking people. Their origins are mysterious and we're not 100% sure, but it's assumed they migrated down from the Caucasus Mountains into Armenia and eventually Upper Mesopotamia. Speaking of migrating, their rulers and nobility are supposed to be of Indo-Aryan origin, and we can see that in their names, loanwords, and most importantly for our context, the term Maria, which in Sanskrit means young hero, young warrior basically. This chariot nobility, equipped in scale armor and armed with a bow and spear, with extremely well-trained and well-fed horses, would form the elite core of their armies, and this method of war would dominate Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Canaan. Manned with 2 crew members, the Marianu would shoot the enemies with their deadly composite bows before charging and exploiting disorganized ranks. When it comes to both Canaan and Mesopotamia, unfortunately for us, we don't have that much archaeological evidence about all the specifics of their chariot designs. Ironically, a piece of evidence would come from an Egyptian source. But we do know that both light skirmishing chariots and heavier Marianu-based elites were used. A confederation of different Canaanite peoples, known to the Egyptian sources as the Hyksos, gradually moved from the south of Canaan into the Nile Delta. They would eventually dominate Lower Egypt, and chariots were a huge factor in their military success and, ironically enough, their downfall. At this time, the Egyptians had no chariots of their own, so they couldn't counter the Canaanite tactics, but eventually they would adapt and beat the Hyksos at their own game. The small kingdoms and even city-states could feel large numbers of chariots. Taken from an account of the Battle of Megiddo, Pharaoh Thutmose III captured over 900 chariots after the battle. The many peoples of Mesopotamia would also use their chariots in a similar manner to the Canaanites, skirmishing with composite bows, javelins, and charging disorganized infantry. As an example of the late Bronze Age and Iron Age, Assyrian reliefs show chariot fighters with composite bows and sometimes even with 3 crewmen, an innovation of the Hittites. The Hittites took the lessons learned from their Marianu enemies to the next level. We see a distinct type of heavy chariot emerge that had the axle under the middle of the cart. Initially, Hittite chariots had 2 crewmen, just like the other armies of the Bronze Age, a driver and a fighter equipped with composite bow, javelins. However, by the late New Kingdom, we see a 3rd crew member added, a shield bearer who would protect the other 2 from projectiles and assist in close combat. The addition of a 3rd crewman made the chariots a lot heavier and less maneuverable, which explains the different design compared to Egyptian or Canaanite chariots, but this allowed the Hittites to dominate melee fights. An extra pair of hands with a shield and spear, yeah, that is very useful. We also have evidence of horses being equipped with scale barding, and while that would make this combination extremely deadly when charging and when stuck in close quarters, they were slow as compared to the Egyptians. This didn't mean that the Hatti would abandon skirmishing and focus on close quarters fighting. No, quite the opposite actually. Chariot archers were not expected to be good with the bow, they were required to be experts. If they failed the target practice, as punishment, they would drink from a cup of piss and then be forced to run naked in front of the soldiers. Yeah, I am not making this up. If you passed it, you would get wine, so I guess if you like drinking, this was the profession for you. Not only the crew was extremely well trained, but so were the horses. We have surviving documents from a captured Mitanni horse trainer named Kikuli. Horses were trained for 214 days, out of which 32 were specifically dedicated to practicing night maneuvers. Yeah, as crazy as it might sound, the Hittites actually trained their horses to be prepared for night battles. We know the Hittites levied a lot of troops from client states, which would also include Canaanite Marianu and lighter skirmishing chariots. But we can't talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the Hatti and not mention the Battle of Kadesh, the biggest chariot battle in history. It's said that the Hittites brought over 3,500 chariots, with some estimates even going as high as 4,000. I'm obviously going to cover the battle in full detail on this channel eventually, but here are some important takeaways. Hittite chariots crossed the Orontes River and ambushed the Egyptian division of Re while they were marching towards the camp of the Ammon division. The Hittites attacked the camp and even broke through the Egyptian shield wall. Ramses II described the crewmen being so well trained that it looked like they were acting as one. However, the momentum of the Hatti attack slowed down, the Egyptians countered, and many Hittites were killed on the retreat by their faster Egyptian counterparts. Speaking of which... So this is a topic we've covered on the channel a few times by now, but hey, can't miss the opportunity to talk about Egypt, so let's go. Thanks to archaeological evidence, we have an extremely clear picture on all aspects of Egyptian chariots, from something as simple as the Phoenician ash or elm wood they used for the construction, or the number of chariots in a squad, all the way to precise battle tactics. The very first Egyptian chariots were based on the Marianu fighting style that dominated much of the known world at that time, and whoa, what a shocker, right? But it didn't take long before they would evolve a completely distinct style of their own, although the fighting was still based mainly on skirmishing with the composite bow. The smallest chariot unit consisted of 10 under the command of the Kejentepi, or better known as the first charioteer. 50 chariots were led by a standard bearer of the chariot warriors, and if needed, a few units of 50 would be combined and led by a unit commander known as the Hejet. Being a charioteer was an extremely prestigious position in the Egyptian army, and it also required a lot of support for the warriors. Reliefs depicting the Egyptian camp at the Battle of Kadesh shows various scribes, stable hands, even carpenters attached to chariot divisions. Egyptian chariots were shockingly light, but this allowed them to be extremely fast and maneuverable when combined with the six-spoked wheel. It also made them usable in a little bit rougher terrain compared to the other chariots at the time. The cost of this fantastic design, though, was its weakness up close. Now, don't get me wrong here. Egyptian crew was far from helpless. They had javelins, spears, even a khopesh as a backup weapon if fighting came that close, but the chariot's construction was extremely fragile in comparison to Canaanite or Hittite chariots, so surviving a direct impact or actually having a prolonged battle would turn out pretty bad. Egyptian chariot archers were extremely well trained, specifically to hit targets on the move. They would skirmish at a really fast speed while moving towards the enemy. If they retreated, the Egyptians would easily catch them and inflict heavy casualties. If the enemy tried charging them, the Egyptian chariots were deployed in precisely determined spacing that allowed them to turn almost on the spot and let the enemy chariots slide through the gaps. And this is where they would meet the chariot runners. If the name wasn't a dead giveaway, they were extremely important for the success of Egyptian armies. Runners were recruited from the fastest soldiers in the army, and they would follow chariots into battle. They were equipped with spears, sometimes light shields, javelins, or even bows if some sources are correct about that. If the Egyptians were already stuck in close combat, the runners would try to kill enemy chariot crews, but if they just charged past the Egyptian chariots, the runners would try to pin the enemies on the other side, so effectively, they would be pinned between the Egyptian forces on both sides. Runners also rescued crashed chariot crew members that survived, and every chariot had assigned runners. At the first Battle of Kadesh, which happened 10 years or so before the more famous second one, Seti I humiliated Hittite chariots. And we already know how effective they were in the second battle. The lightning-fast chariots of Egypt were amazing flank support for the infantry corps, but unfortunately, just like all great things, their time was up. Even though they were extremely important to the success of armies in the Middle East, the Bronze Age collapse would put an end to chariot dominance. Chariots dominated warfare in the Middle East for approximately 1,000 years in their true form. Actual cavalry? Functionally impossible. The chariots provided battlefield control, and they were a multi-purpose war machine. We have evidence of situational scouting, effective mobile skirmishing, and the potential to shock and devastate scattered or sometimes actual infantry formations. You could also run soldiers down and capture them for later, whatever reason they were going to be used, so it was also a plus. Chariots were an almost unmatched factor in battles, depending on the region. So why did they fall out of use? There are many reasons for this. Horses would grow larger, better, faster, stronger, and theoretically that sounds amazing for chariots, right? No. Horses are usable in pretty much all terrain, and they are so much faster than chariots. Not to mention that it's so much easier to maneuver when you're on a horse compared to an actual chariot. Another factor is the collapsing economy of the time. It's so much cheaper to train and maintain one mounted warrior and a horse compared to 2 to 4 horses and a crew member. Not to mention that trade was suffering a massive hit during the collapse, so bronze was extremely expensive. And last but not least, infantry adapted and was able to reliably counter chariots. We're talking about either heavier forms of armor, morale getting better, better training, or even just stepping aside, or hey, getting better with throwing javelins at chariots, I guess. We would still see their occasional use on the battlefield by the time of the early Roman Empire, but for the most part, as from what we know, they were only light skirmishing chariots and glorified battlefield transport in Celtic Britain. It was still a great way to show off how huge your was, however. Alright, another episode done, and don't worry, there's more to come. Just wait, be patient. I hope you learned a thing or two about chariots here, and I hope you actually enjoyed the video. As always, I appreciate your continued support. Every like, discussion even, or even subbing if you're crazy enough, is always very appreciated, and just forces me to do more research on any topic related to the Bronze Age, or hey, we're also gonna visit other time periods, don't worry. But yeah, that's it for now. Where's the next episode gonna take us? You're just gonna have to wait and see. And until the next time...